Hi. Um, okay, so my interest recently has been on the topic of narratives surrounding migration here in the United States and the ways that they have changed over time. For example, when I was in elementary school, I remember there were many times where our teachers were talking about immigration to the United States in the early 20th century, usually European immigration, and people arriving on the shores of Ellis Island, seeing the Statue of Liberty, being overwhelmed with emotion and clutching like the $5 they had in their pocket and taking it and starting an entire new life from practically nothing. And I think these stories permeate throughout our culture because they highlight and reflect a lot of our values as Americans. First of all, our desire to see people picking themselves up by their bootstraps, valuing hard work ethics, and then also providing for one's family. However, if we think about our attitudes towards migration today, and particularly migration at the US-Mexico border, it's like all of a sudden, all of those values have gone completely out the window. How are we viewing family in that context? We're separating families. Are we valuing the work ethics of migrants in our communities when we know that migrant labor makes up or basically like is the backbone of our economy here in the United States. And then I think about how we're looking at people creating something from nothing. Suddenly not having a lot of money when you're arriving to the United States is no longer an endearing quality, and it's something that people see as very negative. And so one of the reasons why I think this is important, reviewing these narratives and thinking about how they changed over time, is because in our current era, we're seeing an increase in migration due to climate breakdown. And I think the way that we're going to move forward requires us to re-examine our viewpoints on migration and thinking about how these narratives are ultimately shaping our policy when it comes to border policy and security, which is basically where my interest in my research interest is at this intersection. So immigration is basically the word that we've been using for the last several years to characterize our our policies surrounding migration. And it basically is what it sounds like. It's a shorter version of the criminalization of immigrants. But immigration as a set of policy initiatives basically describes the strategic enmeshment of immigration law and criminal law. And we can see that at basically all levels of our immigration system, including legislative policies, the procedures that are developed in courtrooms and in community surveillance, and then also the way we enforce immigration policy these days, which is very much through the arm of law enforcement. And so when I think about our future as Americans, and really just Western nations in general, we know that we are starting to enter an era where the acute impacts of climate breakdown are becoming very apparent in many countries around the world. And moving forward and acknowledging this, I think we have to make some decisions about what is the right way to handle mass migration. Climate-related international migration is the research term that basically describes people who are leaving their country to a more prosperous region, either temporarily or permanently. And sometimes that could be caused by the direct effects of extreme weather events like hurricanes, drought, and that sort of thing. But it can also be because of the indirect effects that we often don't consider, such as economic destabilization, political destabilization, and breakdown of government structures, but also health and well-being. Right now, there is, I believe in India, an increased number of men of working age, like 18 to 35, who are starting to die of kidney failure because they are working outdoors in very hot conditions and are in a constant state of dehydration. And so these are other types of effects that we don't typically think about in terms of climate breakdown, but they do. Once these types of effects start hitting people at the household level, a lot of people don't have a lot of options but to relocate. And it makes sense that they would want to relocate to Western regions because we are economically positioned to be able to weather the impacts of climate breakdown compared to other places. And when we're thinking about climate change and mass migration to come in the future, I think our strategy for climate breakdown is really more about criminalizing migrants rather than actually doing anything to meaningfully making meaningful policy changes that would get us to carbon net zero by 2030, like we were hoping to do back when we were part of the Paris Climate Accord. However, we're focused more on putting our resources towards border hardening policies, moving more towards sentiments of isolationism, protecting our own resources, and basically exiling and banishing people who are trying to come to our country. And not only is this ineffective because we still have so many people that are crossing the US-Mexico border, so it's impractical in that region, in that way, but it's also going to become increasingly more expensive when we're talking about migration in mass. We can't afford to build enough cages to keep people from migrating to the United States. So it's really not a very effective policy initiative, although it does serve to make politicians who these private prison companies lobby to build migrant detention centers all along the US-Mexico border. But despite all of these strategies, migration has been identified as a universal human right in the UN International Declaration of Human Rights following World War II, which the US agreed to. And so this is a right that will need increased protection in the years to come. Currently, there is not a protective category identified by the UN for climate refugees, even though we do hear the term climate refugees used in the media a lot. It's not actually a form of asylum. And people who are leaving their homes, even if their home was just completely wiped out by a flood, have there's no recourse for them to seek citizenship status or even asylum in other countries. But so I think we have to really rethink how we're looking at migration and the viewpoints that we have of migrants. And I think if we also consider that the countries that are on the front line of climate breakdown now, people are leaving these countries partly because there's not enough economic stability, particularly following different events that will wipe out a whole country's infrastructure, like Haiti, for example. These countries are mostly former colonized regions. And so I think if you think about it in that respect, I think the West maybe even has an ethical obligation to provide safe pathways for citizenship. So we're kind of on the verge of this period where we still can make better decisions, more ethical decisions, and be the leaders in providing safe pathways for migrants in the 21st century and reframe the way that we're looking at this as a means of subsistence Or we could remember for these sorts of events, which if you don't recognize this is in Del Rio, Texas in 2020, where Border Patrol officer was, several Border Patrol officers were chasing a group of Haitians who were trying to get to the US after the earthquake, and I think like two huge category 4 or 5 hurricanes that followed. So we could either do better, or we could continue doing things like this. It's up to us.